This paper is titled Reification and the Social Ontology of Forms of Life. Why should we turn to the concept of reification in the context of a social ontology of forms of life? I will try to explain this with reference to the Dutch expression de maakbaarheid van de samenleving, which is hard to translate but amounts to something like the malleability of society, or in German, die Machbarkeit der Gesellschaft. Maakbaarheid refers to governmental policies that actively aim to reconstruct society for the better. Ironically, the expression was used to criticize such interventionism as an illusion, or at best, as a failed project. The notion emerged in the 80s and 90s in liberal conservative discourses, most specifically to denounce the welfare state and multiculturalism. Soon, social democrats were keen to endorse this diagnosis as well. The Dutch skepticism towards actively changing society for the better does not stand on its own. We still see politicians argue that there is no alternative but to conceive of a politics anchored in given principles, such as those of the economy. Ironically, such politics does actively implement the form of the market into the social body, thereby undoing the demos, as Andy Brown put it. So why turn to the concept of reification? I believe the notion captures that social arrangements are explained as given things, rather than as products of human practices. Or, as the German philosopher Theodor Adorno put it succinctly, all reification is a forgetting of the social construction of reality. Hence, the problem of reification highlights a challenge for social theory to justify the possibility of change, and to justify that critique is an effective means to achieve change. Lukács, who coined the concept of reification, referred to the standpoint of the workers' movement to solve these issues. In his view, the possibility to actively transform society was bound up with the so-called standpoint of the proletariat. Obviously, the type of partisanship that was available to Lukács is not self-evident anymore today. In fact, with his reflections on reification, Lukács already aimed at the ideological crisis of the workers' movement. All the more reason to consider reification as a paradigmatic problem of what could be called critical theory. In this presentation, I propose to take up the problem of reification within a social ontology of forms of life, following Raal Yegi's work. Like reified social arrangements, forms of life are given as well as created. They are given because we always found ourselves in a web of habitual norms and practices, but they are created since both norms and practices are products of human activity. On an occasion, Yegi indeed argues that her critique of forms of life is motivated by the problem of reification. That is, the phenomenon that a form of life can become an alien force of domination over its human authors. However, I will diverge from Yegi's framework in arguing that the critique of reified forms of life should be conceived of as a standpoint critique. My question hence is, from which standpoint can reification be criticized and the social construction of reality be remembered? As said, I understand reification as the phenomenon that man is capable of forgetting his own authorship of the world. Lukács claimed that in modern capitalist societies, the commodity form inaugurates a new form of objectivity that taints social life beyond the economy in the strict sense. As a result, the commodity form becomes, and I quote, the prototype of all forms of objectivity and all forms of subjectivity that correspond to them. Rather than only taking issue with an ever-widening scope of commodification, Lukács observes that the rationality typical for capitalist production must embrace other, not strictly economic practices. The basis of the commodity form might thus be that, quote, a relation between people takes on the character of a thing, but beyond the economy, the form of objectivity allowing for commodification turns out to function as a prototype or Urbild for non-economic social arrangements as well. To use a Foucauldian expression, one could say that Lukács develops the commodity form as the historical a priori of the capitalist social order, according to which social institutions and their concomitant practices acquire a new objectivity. Lukács' understanding of the commodity form as a form of objectivity indeed has a similar Kant-inspired background. Neo-Kantian philosophers of Lukács' day differentiated between various kinds of objectivity in different social fields, all imbued by a specific form that casts brute perceptions into a meaningful reality. According to Lukács, however, the commodity form came to supersede these separated frameworks of meaning. His theory hence implies a wide understanding of capitalism, according to which the rationality that organizes economic production also conditions other social spheres. Lukács stresses that individuals consequently experience social reality as an inert second nature. The problem of reification thus has a subjective side. The objective, thing-like form in which social arrangements are caused implies, and I quote, the adjustment of one's way of life and hence consciousness to the general socio-economic premises of the capitalist economy, in which all issues are subjected to an increasingly formal and standardized treatment. The formal rationality emerging from the commodity form hence inaugurates a subjective praxis, a verhalten, that relates to itself, others, and the world in a contemplative vein, accepting sociality as objectively given. What results is a form of life. Lukács actually uses the notion to describe capitalist social reality, which is characterized by a forgetfulness of collective authorship over society. Within this world, the reified subject resorts to rationally conform to the scripts organizing society. Here we also recognize Foucault's diagnosis of the neoliberal entrepreneurial self, that similarly engages in a praxis of the self conditioned by the general form of the market. As people relate to reality by optimizing their conduct towards it, the reinterpretation of the norms guiding this form of life tends to remain out of sight. I propose to build on Jaegi's recent work on forms of life to redevelop the implications of the problem of reification. In a text on reification, Jaegi argued that, and I quote, if the critique of reification would provide a perspective on the internal compulsiveness of forms of life without representing all the substantial ideas of the good life, it could regain a terrain that was abundant in the climate of political liberalism. It is no surprise then that Jaegi's critical theory of forms of life takes up this question. And indeed, I believe that if one wants to criticize reification, one should orient itself to forms of life, and vice versa. Jaegi understands forms of life as ensembles of social practices geared to solving problems that are historically contextualized and normatively constituted. A form of life can in turn be criticized by asking whether it succeeds to achieve its own normatively imbued ends. A critique of forms of life hence analyzes forms of life as problem-solving instances. It questions the appropriateness of life forms as the framework to interpret the problems social life poses, and evaluates if a form of life produces a satisfying interpretation of these challenges. The possibility of such critique, however, is not self-evident. As Jaegi admits, forms of life often manifest themselves in an inert way. They tend to present themselves as given. As they materialize and institutionalize, forms of life often become a second nature, hence gaining a thing-like or reified side that outlives our actions, engraving social norms into reality. As a consequence, the self-made character of forms of life is not fully available to individual actors, as Jaegi puts it. The challenge of a critique of forms of life is therefore to point out contradictions between norms and practices, to show the dysfunctionality of a form of life. When such contradictions are experienced as crises, the continuous practical interpretation of norms can turn into a reinterpretation and critique. By pointing at contradictions between norms and practices, the critique of forms of life hence opens paths for social transformation. As such, Jaegi's proposal for a critique of forms of life takes up the commitment of critical theory to deneutralize dominant social structures. More specifically, the deneutralization of capitalist ideology has often been at stake within critical theory. Jaegi signals that early critical theory, inspired by Lukács's work, occupied itself with a wide concept of the capitalist economy that was taken to influence cultural preferences and worldviews beyond the economy in the strict sense. She suggests to move beyond an all-totalizing understanding of capitalism by approaching the capitalist economy as a set of social practices situated within a broader capitalist form of life. As such, economic practices can be understood as part of the same social ontological fabric as other practices. A critique of capitalism as a form of life hence should aim to highlight instances in which the capitalist form of life becomes dysfunctional. However, as Jaegi stresses repeatedly, in the case of capitalism it is less clear what its function should be. She argues that it appears to be quite characteristic of capitalism to deny its status as a particular form of life, thereby making invisible the non-self-evident character of it. This is what I, with Lukács, have called the problem of reification. The norms of capitalist life present themselves in an objectively given, thing-like vein rather than as products of social practices. Capitalism as a form of life, in other words, has its own ethical life, but this ethical life presents itself as an objective rationality rather than as an ethos. Given this ethically neutral self-presentation, contradictions between norms and practices are not self-evidently experienced as crises, let alone as cues to reinterpret social norms. To criticize what is wrong with capitalism hence runs into difficulties following Yegi's model. Following Yegi, we could move to a metacritical level, arguing that there seems something wrong with the social order that relies on an ethics that it at the same time conceals and universalizes as neutral. A critique of capitalism as a form of life then denounces capitalist form of life as bad for its normatively neutral self-presentation. Such metacritique takes issue with a dynamic inherent to the capitalist form of life that makes the reinterpretation of social problems invisible, if not impossible. Strikingly then, Yegi's critique of the capitalist form of life cannot engage in a learning process built upon the transformative reinterpretation of norms and practices. As Yegi admits, however, a metacritique can only be a first step. She will see her observation that one can belong to several forms of life at the same time provides a key to formulate the bottom-up critique of capitalist life without making universalist claims about the good life. To develop this critique, however, we need to return to Lukács first. Lukács infamously privileged the proletariat as imputed to overthrow capitalism. However, when we look more closely at his argument, we see that he locates the possibility to question reification in everyday experiences that cannot find their expression according to the capitalist form of life. This possibility emerges, in Lukács' words, from simple events of every day, which appear as crisis, eruption, or cataclysm, and show the profound irrationality that lurks behind the particular rationalistic disciplines of bourgeois society. In these experiences, as Lukács argues, independent, rationalized, and formal partial laws turn out to be linked in a purely formal way, so that as far as concrete realities are concerned, they can only establish fortuitous connections. Lukács thus emphasizes that reification never entirely captures the concrete aspects and concrete realities of particular human lives. Parts manifest themselves as crises and irrationalities that do not fit the form of objectivity organizing society. In Lukács' narrative, the experience of such crises positions the proletariat to account for its own social situation, to push for the elucidation of its necessity and genesis. My aim is to highlight this situatedness of critique in Lukács' standpoint theory. If the problem of reification highlights that social arrangements don't seem up for interpretation, even if they are experienced as crisis-prone or dysfunctional, the possibility for contestation seems to depend on a shared standpoint within which these contradictions are made visible. Lukács indeed argues that individual standpoints vis-à-vis the totality of society run the risk to remain bound up in an uncritical attitude, as the individual is faced by a complex of ready-made and unalterable objects, which allow him only the subjective responses of recognition or rejection. Practices, needs, and desires that do not fit the rationality of the capitalist form of life are left behind as a multitude of irrational facts that as such cannot persist. By connecting Lukács' standpoint theory with the social ontology of forms of life, the standpoint of critique can be located in ensembles of social practices that run into conflict with dominant social norms. As we have seen, a critique of forms of life puts emphasis on immanent contradictions and dysfunctionalities within forms of life. These crises signal potential for transformation, but only if individuals participating in a particular form of life find ways to deneutralize the social scripts guiding their lives. A less class-oriented approach is commensurable with Lukács' critique of reification, insofar as we can envisage forms of collective life that experience reification as a problem, while at the same time formulating an alternative, normatively imbued framework of relating to the self, others, and the social world. Such approach preserves the social ontological tension at heart of Lukács' theory, namely that of a social reality that is both given, or reified, and made, and therefore open for transformation. Furthermore, a forms of life approach allows for a more nuanced understanding of the reification of society in its totality. Although there is something of a capitalist form of life, this totality is open-ended, building upon a variety of social practices and interpretations of social problems that are clustered in more specific forms of life, spanning from the economy in the strict sense to norm-guided practices in state governmentality, education, or family life, to just name a few. The standpoint to criticize reification can consequently be located in those forms of life that to some extent participate in the capitalist form of life, but do not gain much from it. From these experiences, the capitalist form of life can be experienced as dysfunctional when a particular form of life runs into contradiction with its dominant social norms and their formalization into social institutions. Thus, although a multiplicity of social practices provide building blocks for the capitalist form of life, their problem-solving capacities do not entirely converge with the demands of capitalism. When they conflict, the scripts of capitalist life can lose their neutral, self-evident character. A critique of reification should hence orient itself towards those shared practices, forms of life, that have a contradictory tenet vis-à-vis the capitalist form of life. The works of feminist standpoint theories such as Patricia Hill Collins provide a fruitful example. Using Hill Collins' vocabulary, we can say that the standpoint of critique hinges upon being both an outsider and within the form of life at question. In other words, social practices that are somehow within the capitalist form of life can simultaneously be outside insofar as they are also situated in an ensemble of normatively imbued practices that is at odds with the demands of the larger social whole. Indeed, Lukács already stressed that reification implies such splitting up of man. In other words, the norms of the capitalist form of life only become explicit in the interpretative recourse that ensembles of social practices that are trying, aiming, or simply having to live differently have to it. Beyond the proletariat, people continue to experience forms of alienation, irrationality, or exclusion as the result of how the many facets of social life under capitalism are organized. Sans-papiers, for instance, experience the formalist logic of citizenship as exclusionary. Intersex and trans people conflict with gender classifications that the state and the hospital assign to them. Homeless people misfit the procedures of Social Security for lacking a home address, and members of collective households can lose eligibility for Social Security for not fitting the model of the nuclear family. In all these examples, a particular and often shared lived experience is at odds with the rationality governing social life. Moreover, in all these cases, social structures manifest themselves as objective and given, at least in the first place. And indeed, these standpoints, by necessity, are situated within the capitalist form of life. However, when contradictions between individual ambitions and the reified scripts of the capitalist form of life emerge, the latter's neutrality and givenness can lose its self-evidence. From these experienced dysfunctionalities, then, the norms of the capitalist form of life can be reinterpreted. In sum, by assessing reification against the backdrop of an open-ended social ontology of forms of life, the standpoint of critique can be situated in shared efforts to alter one's own life. Countercultures, or what Daniel Lowy called politics of forms of life, are explicit examples to live differently from socially dominant forms of life. But beyond these more explicitly political projects, more day-to-day practices can also be situated to question reified societal norms. These everyday practices remind of what Foucault calls counterconducts. They are no political revolts, but do stand in an immediate and founding correlation to the way conduct is constituted by dominant forms of life. As such, living differently can have a domino effect, insofar as shared life choices bear the potential to illuminate the contingency of dominant social norms that hitherto were experienced as reified and given. As such, they comprise an enormous political resource that often remains beyond the scope of theories of political resistance.